Ready when you are.
Hello, John.
Matt, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. I'm all right. How are you?
Somewhat better than, sorry for the medically induced hiatus last week. We're back and ready to talk about not just one, but two episodes of Doctor Who. We haven't talked about two episodes of the program for a while. So obviously we're going to have a volcanically baked take on the Interstellar Song Contest. But before that, we're going to be talking about The Story in the Engine, which came out obviously the previous week.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, looking forward to chewing through these very light-hearted tales.
I know. I was going to say that for our first episode in a while, where we're looking at more than one episode of Doctor Who, we've picked two absolutely lightweight, thematically not much to talk about.
Yeah.
It's made things easy on ourselves.
Yep.
Anyway,
okay.
Well, let's kick off. You give us some of the stats on The Story in the Engine first.
Yeah, so The Story in the Engine was broadcast or released, unleashed into the wild on the 10th of May 2025. And it is largely set in, well, is it? It's nominally largely set in Lagos, Nigeria, although obviously most of it is taking place in a sort of interstellar waiting room, which is not quite sure where its geographical location is. But it's it's basically set in Lagos. The Doctor is visiting his mate Omo who runs a barbershop, and the Doctor and various and the barber and a new mysterious barber and some customers are basically trapped in this shop and have to keep recounting stories in order to feed the beast, as it were, which is sort of taking them on an intergalactic journey. And the rationale and motivations and why this is happening then is the kind of puzzle that has to be sorted through in the episode. Belinda obviously is the companion. She doesn't really feature very much, to be honest, which again is sort of bold choice given how little screen time we're going to be spending with her this season. This was written by Inua Ellams, who is a Nigerian-born British playwright, poet, performer, and had, I think, been decorated with various honours in recent years, and was obviously come into the show with a background that lends itself very strongly to what this episode intends to do in terms of its discussion of oral histories in African and particularly West African culture, and it's directed by Michaela McPherson, who I haven't come across, but is a director and also a playwright apparently. So yeah, she is both those things. But yes, so as I say, this very, very strongly angled at exploring the power of stories and what they mean. And there are very universal themes there. It's made explicit in terms of the number of kind of story gods or tricksters that have existed, that this is by no means a sort of parochially Nigerian concern. This is something very broad and applicable to everybody. Though it's certainly, by being located in a barber shop, which is a very culturally potent sort of symbol of, particularly, it has to be said, male exchange of stories and gossip within West African and diaspora culture, and the power of particularly the oral tradition of sharing stories. That those things are absolutely critical to what this episode is about. And I think, broadly speaking, whether people like this episode or not is going to hang on whether they are carried with this philosophical kind of exploration of the meaning of stories and words and cultural exchange over whether it amounts to a hill of beans in terms of making any kind of sense. Because it sort of goes in a, and we talked about the parallels between this run of Doctor Who and season 24, I think, the Sylvester McCoy run before. This felt super season 24 on steroids, in terms of trying to be lofty and elevated and philosophical and ambitious. And I suspect people's mileage will vary somewhat as to whether A, they like that kind of thing, because people may or may not, and B, whether they feel that it's been elegantly done.
Yeah.
So I've set up, I think, as best I can.
You set that up beautifully.
Thank you. So yeah, did you like this?
Yeah. So basically, if you need a 2-word answer to that, the answer is yes. Asterisk. I think it is. I thought this was absolutely fascinating, like really fascinating, and
yeah, I would agree with that.
It's left me with sort of more to sort of chew on and ponder than many episodes of Doctor Who, I would say, in many a year. I think this is sort of well, I was going to say a radical sort of rewiring of what Doctor Who can do. Actually, I don't think it is at all by any means. But I think in terms of just making a really bold stroke of saying, actually within the cultural traditions of West Africa, there is space to tell a Doctor Who story. And proving that thesis beautifully. I think this episode succeeds wildly. It's so exciting to see an episode of Doctor Who told completely outside of the British storytelling vernacular. And this I was thinking a lot during the week actually about how there is all, in terms of the tropes that we lean back on when we talk about Doctor Who, like Britishness is always something that comes up so many times. And the more I think about that, the more I don't think that necessarily holds up as an argument. I think we've always leaned on, Britishness as a trope of Doctor Who, in a way to sort of explain why it feels like such a square peg compared to mainstream American sci-fi, which feels very different. But actually, if you look at Doctor Who in the context of British television, Doctor Who is an awkward square peg in British television as well. There aren't many other British TV shows that you feel it sort of is part and parcel with. So in terms of like actually saying, no, do you know what? We're going to just locate Doctor Who in a completely different cultural experience, and it's one of the things I really admire about this is that it's not tokenistic about it. It's not, I don't go online looking for sort of straw manning bad faith arguments, so I don't know whether there was any.
They come looking for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, maybe they will after this. I don't know if there's been any sort of gnashing of teeth from the sort of anti-woke crowd about this. But I would say that, if that is a criticism you're going to level about this, you are basically saying that you do not want to see the presence of Africans in Doctor Who. There is nothing about this that is sort of tokenistically representative or even sort of earnest in trying to put these things on screen. It is just a really elegant piece of it's a very elegant structure, I would say, or proof of concept for saying we can, hey, this form of West African sort of culture, storytelling, location, Doctor Who can belong here and live here. And I would say to actually extend that even to the point where it actually rallies around. I think the point that this sort of reaches at the end is saying like Doctor Who stories can belong here because ultimately, spoiler warnings as always, the story basically resolves, or at least as far as I can tell that it resolves. Therein lying some of my criticism of it, with the Doctor basically plugging his own life experience into the story engine and crashing it because his story is the greatest story ever told. It's too big. His life is too big for the story engine to handle. And so you actually get
which was a beat that we had in Lux as well.
Absolutely,
The,
absolutely.
the,
But
the Doctor's lived experience is so powerful that it just resolves everything, because his is. I mean, they used the phrase "the greatest story ever told" in Lux. So the kind of parallels, and RTD has been accused of this. Accused. He's had this leveled at him. I suspect some people would consider it an accusation, but the lonely god thing really starts with. Well, I suppose you can point again to the kind of Cartmel era to a certain extent, but the lonely god stuff, RTD sort of really puts that to the fore. And yeah, that's an interesting echo from this episode through back to Lux.
Absolutely. But I would also say, of all of the reasons why, and this obviously from the Moffat era onwards increased in frequency of like the sort of the clip reels of the old Doctors, being given an airing to show, give the fans a little bit of, tickle the bellies of the fans to show them, some clips of old Doctor Who. But actually, for all that this is radical in its situating of Doctor Who within a West African storytelling tradition, the seeing clips of the Five Doctors and Trial of a Time Lord at the end feels entirely earned in the context of what the story is trying to tell. So actually, it really compellingly makes the case for saying, hey, we don't have to be locked into this sort of a British and primarily English view of sort of what the parameters of Doctor Who are. This is a character, this is a mode of storytelling that can sit in any tradition. So that's kind of my big picture on it. Also, I think the setup is absolutely brilliant. Like the first 15 minutes of this, I think are really, really compelling.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
In terms of how elegantly it sort of introduces, and I think it's you said, Inua Ellams has written about the cultural importance of barbershops in West African culture in previous work for the stage. And actually how that, bearing in mind that, this is likely to almost certainly to be watched by a majority white audience, how it sets that up, again, without sort of, obviously the Doctor acknowledges that he's black and the importance of, barbershops within West African culture. But also there's just something very pleasing in quite a McCoy. I mean, we keep coming back to the McCoy era on this, of just saying, basically the Doctor saying like, hey, I'm a Time Lord, it's a tough life, sometimes I just need to go to a place where I can just be one of the guys, and this is one of them. Which is a lovely character beat for the Doctor, and at the same time serves to give us a little crib sheet on what the if we're not familiar with the sort of trope of the West African barbershop, what that means here. So all of that is great.
Inua Ellams did for the National Theatre this series, the Barbershop Chronicles, right? This play for the National Theatre in London, and the kind of copy that the National Theatre produced around this was that that particular work looked at what it means to be a black man, an African man, and an immigrant living in the 21st century UK, and the story is about finding shelter in the barbershop. And so, far be it for me to accuse Inua Ellams of just simply rehashing some old work lying down the back of the sofa, but I think that undoubtedly Russell T Davies has gone, I can see how this would. And he's so Magpie-like in terms of his grabbing together all the different things that could work within the context of Doctor Who, and saying, you know what, I want this in this context. And I think that I have nothing really to add to your summary there. That this is great from Doctor Who. The character of the Last of the Time Lords, it works in that perspective, and it very much also works as a glimpse to the viewer of what that contested experience of being particularly a black man, is. Because obviously the Doctor says about going to this barbershop in Lagos as a retreat, but obviously the primary audience of this. Famously, there is a Nigerian audience for Doctor Who. I think some of the oldest episodes of Doctor Who have been found in Nigeria. So, so I'm not denying that there's going to be a local viewership there, but certainly, I would imagine that the majority of the black audience watching this won't be watching it in Nigeria, and a significant portion of them watching it in the UK. And so to have that slightly, I mean, I was very interested with regard to Inu Elams that he's quoted as saying, "I became a black man when I arrived in England," and so that sense of othering, which the Doctor is seeking to just get away from by seeking solace in the barbershop, it is something that I'm sure a lot of people who have that personal experience would be glad to see it represented. But it's always helpful as someone who is not a black male to have that experience revealed to me.
Yeah, totally. No, I think it's so elegantly done because, as you say, it's like it's not, how it unifies both the Last of the Time Lords and being a black man is tied together so elegantly. I would also say that I think that sorry, go on.
But where it falls apart for me is when it remembers it has to be a sci-fi show.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like,
the story.
If it was literally just the Doctor goes here to relax and they tell stories and there's some animated bits and some filmed inserts and there's a degree of cultural exchange, I sort of wish it had just been that. And when it has to remember, actually, there's some Disney money, let's make a spider and let's have this and that and the other. And the whole story around the barber, as in the sort of the antagonist, who is meant to have been this kind of trickster who was creating these stories for the gods and then gets pushed aside. Brilliantly played by Ariane Bakare, like brilliantly played. It's an outstanding performance of ambivalence, and
it's so good.
And his shot at redemption at the end feels very earned, and yet all of the guff around the spider and the Nexus and the control room and all the rest of it feels like it doesn't really sing with the rest of everything else. Everything else is so elegant, and that feels so shunted on, basically.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing. I mean, as I was going to say, once it gets past those first 15 minutes, and as I say, the setup, like, basically the spooky barbershop, the telling the stories appearing in the window, the hair growing, that when the guy's hair starts growing, that's a brilliant moment. It's so Doctor Who. I was properly like sort of, when that happened.
Yeah.
And then, it just settles into this, so basically the story itself is, it's so incoherent and a bit of a mush that everything just sort of like washes past in a sort of haze, which is such a shame because it's such a great setup. And as you said, like, I think all of the performances are absolutely magnificent in this. What a great cast. I think it is basically a classic example of Doctor Who butting up against its limitations, where like the ambition is brought to heel by the fact that it has to be Doctor Who. You mentioned season 24 in the McCoy era earlier, which obviously we've talked about a lot in this run. I think I've seen this view online somewhere as well, so I'm by far from the only one. But I think the closest comparison to this in the classic series run is Ghostlight, where
duh,
absolutely jam-packed full of ideas, but everything has to be so compressed into this framework that actually, moment to moment, it's quite hard to tell what's going on. It's quite hard to follow the story, and at the end of it, it's quite hard to sort of tell what we've just seen. And we're so used to thinking of Doctor Who's, when I say it's butting against the limitations of being Doctor Who, as old school fans, we're really used to thinking of that in primarily sort of financial or economic terms, i.e., you want to do a story that is a 50 million year war of like nuclear war of attrition between 80 million planets, but you've got 50p and Blue Peter need the studio back in 24 hours. Yeah, it's that kind of thing. We're used to it being like an economic problem. The limitations of Doctor Who, and I'd put a side note on the fact I think it's interesting how small a lot of the episodes have felt this series in terms of just being like sort of single sets, closed rooms, all of that. But setting that aside, because obviously there's a considerable CGI budget at least for this series. Like the limitations now are it has to be in and out in 45 minutes, and it's like. No, there's so much sort of potential richness in here that I sort of think there's an easy case to be made for the fact that it might have been fixed if it was given an extra 15 minutes to tell its story. If maybe you could have introduced a little B plot somewhere else in the city, maybe. I mean, the other issue here is,
I mean, that for me just dramatically felt like the missing beat. I know that they square the circle by getting eventually Belinda into the shop, and then she has her story, but what really this needed was a parallel track of her in the city putting together the clues, which they sort of do as a snapshot, but it needed to run longer in parallel, I feel, to sort of bring that A-B side to greater balance.
Absolutely. And I sort of feel that, like, by having to compress everything down so much, it then starts to make sort of silly errors that you sort of feel could have been caught. Like, a friend of mine pointed out to me on text that the scene where Abena is doing the doctor's hair, she's doing the braids and telling the story about how slaves used to conceal maps in braids as a route of escape because the slavers didn't understand or didn't give any consideration to black hair.
Yeah.
And then you've got the realization that that's what she's doing to the doctor and that's his route out of there. That beat would have landed so much more if we'd known that there was a maze outside the building, but it's like it is introduced through that moment and then he pops out and then there's a maze there, so it's sort of a wasted beat, really.
Yeah.
So
it's also not clear why there would be a maze.
No.
So yeah. And like let's just unpack a little bit the motivation of the barber. As I say,
well, you may have to explain this to me because I've watched this once and I didn't quite catch it.
But it's a spellbinding performance by Arion Bakare. As I say, like a tour de force of ambivalence. So he was basically a trickster and a storyteller who would tell stories for the gods, which helped them to weave together this web called the Nexus. And then they realized that the Nexus was so good at sort of self-sustaining its exchange of stories that they didn't need him anymore. And he wants to destroy the Nexus to punish the gods for having abandoned him. Now, thematically, you see, I liked this episode much better in practice. No. It's really tough. I feel like that there's the theory and the practice. And I think that in practice, the representation of the main focus of representing this cultural idea of order exchange and Western African culture and the lived experience of being a black man, both within Nigeria, but also the immigrant experience, which is effectively what Ncuti Gatwa's doctor is in this case. All of that kind of works, and it's exact, and it's elegant, and it's beautifully done. And even like when the stories are being told, and there's the kind of whether it's live action or animated inserts, that whole stuff is super elegant and looks great and works together. And then you've got this plot stuff with the barber, which again I think thematically makes sense, but when you're watching it as a piece of television and sort of explaining, well, this is my motivation and this is my through line to why I'm doing this, it somehow, and I think it's to do with the connection with the visuals, because everything that's elegant about the smallness that you mentioned, right? So you've got that smallness of the barber shop and the intimacy of that, and it's beautifully observed. And actually, there was some location shooting in Lagos. There was a team
Yeah.
that did some location shooting, and that's blended very nicely with what's obviously well shot, sort of market scenes and so on and so forth. All of that works well. And then as soon as you see that bloody spider's web and the CGI spider, and I'm sure this didn't happen, right? I'm absolutely certain this didn't happen, but you can sort of imagine some extremely fat cigar smoking going, "Hey, what we need right here is some CGI. We need a monster. This is a movie, And as soon as you see that spider and the web, you're taken out of a kind of you're taken out of a thematic, philosophical, sort of dreamlike framework into a kind of, oh well, actually there's a nuts and bolts reality. And as soon as you're thinking about it in a nuts and bolts reality kind of way, none of this makes any sense. And so it took me out of it basically. As soon as oh right, okay, so there's a sci-fi thing going on here. Well, like so I'm literally looking at this web and it exchanges stories for the gods. Why? The thing is, I'm looking at the web and I'm seeing like energy shoot from one bit to another and the spider's walking along it. Like, what is the spider? Why is the spider there? What is the web? How does it exchange it? Is that energy that's going along the thing? And it's just and so you end up in this thing where it would have been better never to see any of that, basically.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Yeah.
And this is, you've done a great job of sort of unpacking the barber storyline. We also have the character of Abena in this, who, and she,
daughter.
Yeah, which again, and as I say, I've watched this once, and so it may well be the case that it, like Ghostlight, it requires multiple close watches and a director's cut some 30 years down the line on Blu-ray or whatever, and a script book and piles of contextual information. But I did not read what her role in this or motivation was, and even then, obviously it's implied that she is somewhat embittered through a previous encounter with Joe Martin's doctor, and we haven't mentioned her. Joe Martin gets a little cameo in here, which again is just another beat that goes by so fast, but clearly is of some sort of importance that I just I missed it, and it may well be the case that it's there, and on my third or fourth watch I can spot it, but absolutely, in the moment I did not see that.
But also, like, when did Joe Martin appear as the Doctor?
So it was in
2019.
Yeah, basically
2019. She's in Flux, right?
She's in Flux. She's in the previous season in The Fugitive of the Jadoon, remember?
So
she's
we're talking
lying low.
like 5 years ago. I mean, I'm not sure that the average punter would necessarily have clocked the meaning of that moment. Because there's that bit in the TARDIS where the Doctor says, like Ncuti Gatwa says, I'm the first version of myself that's had this colour skin. And then Joe Martin pops up to sort of remind him, actually, no, hello.
Yeah.
But it's sort of weird to me because I did feel a bit like the cut to David Tennant looking scared in the kind of Midnight sequel, The Well, which was kind of referencing a 17-year-old piece of television that people may or may not have been alive for when it first went out. I did wonder how many people would have clocked who Joe Martin was and what she represented and what that was all about. But the other thing was so there's the group of people who would have no idea what that meant, who would have just been baffled, and then there's the group of people who know exactly who Joe Martin is, who are going, how come he remembers her? So how come he remembers this experience of being her? So I just wasn't completely convinced from a geek point, like just from a technical point of view. I wasn't sure that it really worked, but it gets a pass because it's Joe Martin.
Yeah, it gets past from me partly because I really like Joe Martin's Doctor, and it's nice to see a bit more of her. The other thing is also, and I think we've talked about this off mic. I'm not sure if we've ever addressed it on mic, but it's like one of the interesting things that I find, or one of the things I have found interesting about this Russell T Davies 2.0 run is how he's able to make far more elegant deployment of narrative beats that came up on Chris Chibnall's watch than Chris Chibnall ever was. So in terms of, you know, the Doctor being an orphan of unclear origin, you know, which he found far more dramatic use for that with the Ruby storyline last year than Chibnall ever did. And likewise, I quite like the fact Joe Martin here is deployed in the place where Stephen Moffat would have put a CGI Hartnell, basically. It's basically saying, you know, this is an adventure from a long time ago, very early on in the Doctor's life. And yes, rather than putting in a slightly shoddily colorized clip of Hartnell, we have a we have Joe Martin instead. So I kind of think that's quite pleasing in a way. But that said, you're right that I'm not sure if that character has the same cut through to the point where anyone watching this would immediately go, oh, the Doctor and Abanar have prior history because that is the Doctor, in a way, which again is just speaking to the insane compression that this episode has to go through in order to hit the running time. I mean, likewise, and this is a thing that's come up elsewhere in this season as well. The way that the Doctor, you know, obviously it's established that he has a long friendship with Omo, and you know, we're told about that. But again, because it's just like we're told about it, and then almost like 4 minutes later, the Doctor is crying at Omo's betrayal, and it's sort of, we're back into kind of Sasha 55 territory here from like at the beginning of the run, where it's like, I don't think it's, if you expect us to sort of read these as like huge emotional beats for the Doctor, like you can't just tell us that this person is important to the Doctor and then cut to him crying as that person dies or betrays him or whatever. Also, it doesn't really make sense. It's not really a betrayal. It's not like Omo sent out a message to reel the Doctor in and lure him into a trap or anything. So, you know, even on its own merits, that doesn't really make sense. But at the same time, you know, it's like...
No. It was really weird that the Doctor suddenly got so angry with him. It was just, oh, okay. Maybe that was meant to be. Maybe that was meant to be a sort of just a very human beat of irrationality. But as it within the compressed world of this 45-minute episode, you didn't have the space for that relationship to be believable in its closeness.
Totally.
And therefore it didn't have the space to be believable in terms of the irrationalities which also emerge in friendships. So yeah, I agree with you.
No, and I think that's one of those things is like, much as I am inclined to be very favourable, to look very favourably on this episode, or to view it through a very favourable lens because of what it tries to achieve. One of our recurring critiques of this year's run in particular of Doctor Who is unearned emotional beats. And this is absolutely chock full of them, left, right, and centre. I think just because of the brevity and the compression of what makes it to the screen. Also, you know, we've last couple of weeks, I think we had quite a lot of good things to say about Murray Gold's work on The Well and Lucky Day, but here, I'm sorry, it's just the almost relentless kind of soaring strings over what is ultimately, and this is actually the thing, I hadn't sort of quite put the pieces together in terms of, obviously this is written by someone whose work has primarily been for the stage and directed by I think you said that the director is also a playwright, which I wasn't aware of this. And it's sort of that sort of tonal disjunct about, like, basically this feels, you know, it's very talky, and on a single set most of the action takes place, and it is basically, you know, oral storytelling. And the sort of the smallness of that, but then given the full Hollywood strings treatment all the way through it, that Murray Gold delivers, is just one of those things that makes it feel like such a sort of tonal mush.
Mm.
I mean, that's not to say that if you gave it a different score, that those problems, those narrative compression problems that we flagged, wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
But it is really one of those things that just makes you go, I don't. The music's doing one thing, the dialogue's doing another. It's like I don't know. What am I supposed to feel?
I
Just
did
want to
think,
live.
just as I don't know the extent to which this was intended by Inwa Elams, but I thought that another element of the plot that might have been aimed at was to do with creativity and authorship in an age of AI, because,
Yeah.
as I say, like, well, Inua Ellams was very. He's given an interview in which he said that in thinking of the character of the barber, he was reminded of the fact that the French term for ghostwriter is le nègre, so literally
Oh, really?
black person, right?
Yeah.
And so that, but and that's, by the way, not considered. Well, it's not, that isn't considered derogatory. Le nègre being the, I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but it seems curious to a British English ear, I have to say.
Yes.
But and that person doesn't get the credit for the work they're doing, which is an interesting sort of starting point for an exploration of things. But if you think about the plot, if we take it on its own terms, what we're saying is basically there's a storyteller who who relates lots of stories, collects stories, relates them, authors them, sends them into a network where they ping back and forth, and the network works so well by itself that we don't need the author anymore. And there is a lot of debate at the moment about large language models and their ability to learn from training data, i.e., stuff people made, and whether that
Yeah.
is essentially copyright theft or theft of material which then gets regurgitated. Now, I don't actually know whether this is something that Inua Ellams intended, but it certainly feels to me to be the most elegant read of why that web nexus stuff was necessary, because, to be honest, I
Yeah.
think it's a bit bolted on. I'm not trying to rehabilitate it. I don't think it quite lands, but I can see something there. I can see that there might have been an attempt to sort of land something that also made that point.
I also, just when you were giving the opening summary of what this episode was about, and you referred to it as how everyone has to go in and offer up another story in order to feed the beast, I was thinking, who might have some sympathy for that? Maybe Russell T Davies, maybe Stephen Moffat. There's also something about, and I don't know. I mean, there's quite, this season of Doctor Who in particular has been quite meta in terms of that whole sequence in Lux of in the middle where they break out and meet the Doctor Who fans.
Yeah.
I don't know whether or not there was an intentional beat or otherwise for saying, like, you know what, it's just this juggernaut that demands another fucking story every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And you got to feed something into it.
The two wankers over a web stream are going to tear apart and dissect and fucking, go on about this doesn't work and this does work and all the rest of it. And, here I am plugging away, trying to, shove coal in the engine. Screw you.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, though. I mean, but I sometimes grapple with this, actually. The extent to which, particularly recent work, the extent to which we do pull it apart in a way that can seem somewhat unsympathetic at times. But then I would also say Davis, Moffat, Chibnall, all from the fan industrial complex. And any time where I have a pang of guilt about this, I just remember a young Chris Chibnall confronting Pip and Jane Baker on on TV in the mid '80s, and just think, well, yeah, karmically, it may one day fall for us to have to make Doctor Who, and then we'll be laughing. It won't. That won't happen.
Well, speaking of feeding the beast, obviously
Yeah.
this isn't the only story that they've had to chuck in the screen in the last 2 weeks, and indeed, not the only one that we have to discuss, because we also are going to catch up with yesterday's episode, the Interstellar Song Contest.
That was a masterful segue, John. Worthy of Ryland himself.
Yes, or I was aiming for Madeley, but I'll hold for that. Yeah. So obviously, the Interstellar Song Contest was broadcast on BBC One directly before the Eurovision Song Contest. So there was very much a kind of deliberate thematic run-in there. Interestingly, Ncuti Gatwa was slated to have been giving the UK jury read to the Eurovision Song Contest and pulled out like the day before, with absolutely no explanation. You do wonder whether the powers that be at the European Broadcasting Union, or indeed some of the sponsors, may have got wind of what was happening in the Doctor Who episode that was preceding this, and whether that had any impact on. That's pure speculation, by the way.
I would also say there has been a lot of speculation online about the nature of that pullout, and I would suggest that we would all be well advised to steer clear of it until Ncuti Gatwa has
Who knows? He may have had an ingrowing toenail. So yes, but it certainly would not surprise me if those involved in the Eurovision Song Contest were less than entirely delighted with the content of the Interstellar Song Contest, as I suspect we will come on to discuss. So this was indeed released yesterday, 17th of May 2025, and it is basically the Doctor and Belinda arrive at the Interstellar Song Contest, which is absolutely, completely coded as an intergalactic direct descendant of the Eurovision Song Contest, although they are, for contractual reasons, not allowed to use the word Eurovision at any point. But they arrive at the Interstellar Song Contest, which is as Luke Besson-y as you would imagine it to be, sort of Fifth Element style-y, crazy aliens singing stuff, lots of camper armor. It's extremely deliciously designed and great to look at. But obviously there's has to be some peril. So there's terrorist infiltration of the control room, and the apparent mass killing of like 100,000 people in the stadium, and it emerges that the terrorist threat is coming from somebody whose planet has been ravaged by a corporation which is the lead sponsor of the Interstellar Song Contest, and the Doctor has to basically sort that out. And that's essentially the background here. The episode was written by Juno Dawson. This is her first, first Doctor Who.
First TV Doctor Who. She was the sort of lead writer on that Doctor Who Redacted podcast drama a few years ago, which I've not. I've not listened. I've not listened to that. I'm told it was pretty good, actually, and it's sort of been on my radar. Actually, something to check out as something with certainly the first season, which has got Jodie Whittaker's Doctor in it, but to see what that how that character would be deployed outside the auspices of Chris Chibnall is something that intrigues me greatly, and I have been meaning to check out. But no, she did that. I think she's done a couple of novels as well. But this is her first broadcast or TV broadcast Doctor Who credit.
And it was directed by Ben A. Williams, not to be confused with Ben Williams. So, Ben A. Williams, not Ben V. Williams, the definite article you might say. No, so Ben A. Williams, who I know nothing about. So poor Ben. Sorry, Ben. And yeah, lot going on here. This seems to be. This is a really sly episode, because everything about it is aesthetically coded as this is a knockabout romp.
Yes,
and yet this is probably one of the most brutal
Yeah.
and potentially contentious episodes of Doctor Who ever made.
Yes.
Because when the terrorist kid brings down the shield, because it's on a space station and they're in open space, brings down the shield and 100,000 people are sucked up, and you at that moment think to their deaths, and you're looking at a cloud of 100,000 people dying, dead. That is harrowing.
I can't think of anything else in Doctor Who that has just shown an atrocity of that scale. It's extraordinary. And I think, I mean, as you say, I think it's not to, well, we'll get on to what I thought about this and indeed what you thought about this. But I would say that one of the things that I admire about this episode is its control of tone in that regard. In that I think Juno Dawson is walking a hell of a tightrope here, and this is before we get onto the merits or demerits of the episode, per se. But to be able to marry the sort of the I would say the camp aesthetic of Eurovision with the horror and brutality and nastiness, I think, in places. I mean, obviously this is what the Doctor's arc in this story, and the fact that we watched the Doctor torture a guy at one point is sort of extraordinary. But it does it manages that tonal balance, I think, extremely skillfully, I thought. But yeah, go on. Who's going to feel this one first?
But we're dancing around the we're dancing around the main macaroon here, which is that this is extraordinarily on the nose about the actual setup of Eurovision and its relationship with Israel, particularly.
Israel is very much the elephant in the room here, I think, both in terms of what the story's driving at, but also the context in which it emerges. And that's something that, I mean, I watched this a few hours ago. It's something that I've been sort of trying to line up in my head. So I would, where are you coming out on this?
So let's start with the basics. The lead sponsor of the Eurovision Song Contest is Moroccan Oil, which is not a Moroccan company. It is an Israeli company. It is an Israeli cosmetics company. So there's that. And what we have here is in the Interstellar Song Contest, the terrorist is targeting the Interstellar Song Contest because it is sponsored by the corporation, and they are leveling an accusation of, well, it's very clear within the context of the show that the corporation has committed genocide against the Hellion people, I think it is, right? And the Eurovision Song Contest has as its lead sponsor an Israeli cosmetics company. Now, I know absolutely nothing about the relationship between that company and the Israeli state, which is currently subject to a huge amount of international opprobrium for its conduct in the conflict in Gaza. So I am not making any comment as to Moroccan Oil's position
complicity
on those matters.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have that conversation. But this is not, we're not reaching here in terms of the parallels.
And I would say I didn't know that about the sponsorship of the Eurovision Song Contest. So that basically completely sort of reframes a lot of what I was scratching my head about, which is that, I mean, I'm obviously aware that Israel's involvement in the Eurovision Song Contest for the last two cycles of Eurovision since October the 7th in 2023 has Israel's involvement in Eurovision has become a bit of a lightning rod for where some sort of focused sort of criticism and boycotting of Israel sort of has taken place. And I suppose, I mean, this is an episode, from what I understand, production on this episode started late in 2023. The episode, I think, presumably would have been written much earlier. And my read on it was very much, I mean, this episode is, definitely political in its sort of intention, in its commentary around sponsorship and the military industrial complex and corporatism and all of these kind of things. The question in my head was whether or not this is another example of an episode being written in 2023 and being broadcast in 2025, where the context around the escalation of Israel's assault on Gaza has changed fundamentally. I had absolutely no idea about what you just told me about sponsorship, which very much does change the read, because this is an episode that, whilst it has it has a terrorist in it, and it is it doesn't hand wave away the idea that even if the terrorist may be the victim of injustice, that nevertheless their actions are reprehensible in this context, in terms of the supposed mass murder that we're being asked to look at on screen. It primarily, the root of this sort of cycle of hate, if you like, is the actions of the sponsor. So that's,
well, I think that's
you give me a lot to chew on in real time here.
I mean, and it is worth noting as well that Moroccan Oil has been sponsoring the Eurovision Song Contest since 2019.
Right.
So it would have been completely possible for Juno Dawson and RTD to have wanted to burst that particular bubble prior. Let's assume, for the purpose of argument, as you say, the production was late into 2023. I think it was recorded in early 2024. So it's entirely possible that they would have alighted on this theme prior to the Hamas atrocities in October, and then the subsequent Israeli offensive. But as they were then in later production and recording, it would have become very clear, because international criticism of Israel's military conduct was relatively swift.
Yeah,
it would have been very, very deep in the weeds of realizing that this was live. So I don't think we can say, well, this was written then, and it, I mean, they would have recorded this in the full glare of
what Israel was doing,
playing out. Yeah. Now the question is, do we feel, because we have often been quite critical of stuff that is like, I think particularly about the Zygon inversion, stuff which feels so on the nose that it somehow loses its potency. And this is like, this isn't, this is what this is about.
Yeah,
this is literally what this is about.
I think there's a real question here about whether or not the how closely the metaphor is asking you to read the material and overlay your own understanding of real world events on it. How that affects how you receive this as drama, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you alighted on what the sort of the broad through line is that Juno Dawson has gone for here. And I would like to just affirm that that's my understanding of it too, that basically what it's essentially doing is taking a structuralist view. It's like, you cannot excuse kids' actions, and the terrorism and murder that he is wanting to indulge in is unmistakably branded as reprehensible, right? There is no moral justification within the framework of the story and the Doctor allows him no moral justification. In fact, is very righteous in condemning Kid for his actions and punishing him in the most brutal and offensive ways. So there's a very clear sense that what this is doing is it's taking a structural point of view, which is to say that the terrorism of Kid is not excusable, but the circumstances of the corporation torching his planet would inevitably lead to the creation of people like Kid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, you could also say it sort of it extends that slightly in terms of just basically where that cycle of sort of violence and destruction ultimately leads you in. That, yeah, absolutely, you've got the Helion planet is absolutely ravaged by the corporation, thereby creating, the fertile soil to produce a terrorist like Kid, who then, in the confrontation with the Doctor, that the Doctor doesn't escape this cycle of violence. The Doctor tortures him. The Doctor tortures Kid in a way that is quite grueling and disturbing to watch. So I did cross my mind whether or not there was, and obviously we can critique whether this is an interesting, view for Juno Dawson to take, but there is something about sort of just the perpetuating cycle of violence here, that it becomes a sort of nexus that sort of absorbs everyone in its wake, to the point where even, the most morally upstanding character has a moment where he goes too far in torturing someone.
Yes. And I thought that was a legitimate exploration of the Doctor's character. It was good to see Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor being taken into that range that he's got, but by the script allowing him to go into that territory in much the way that Moffat more frequently did with Capaldi, knowing he'd got the chops to do it, basically.
Yeah.
And Gatwa definitely has the chops to do it. And I like him angry. I think that it's a very interesting thing to see someone who is conflicted by their sense of righteousness and their moral code. Like when the moral code butts up against the righteousness that affords them, it's quite an interesting dynamic. So I liked all that. I did less as I was watching it, more in retrospect. I do sort of find myself thinking, how do I really feel about sequins and glitter cannons and high camp as the kind of as the kind of transport vehicle for the discussion of something that is so intractable and difficult.
I have to part company with you there, because I think that is absolutely something that queer audiences have always understood camp as a radical act and as a political tool, and as something very much to be used in those circumstances. I think it's only when
sorry,
it's sort.
I'm
it's
thinking aloud. I'm not. I'm not saying I definitely think it was bad. Was it well done enough to warrant it? And I'm actually not sure. I think I could watch this episode 3 or 4 times and not quite land what I think about it.
See, I thought I think it's one of those things where, like, I was absolutely riveted by this, and I think it is brave. I mean, it's really brave, particularly with the additional context that you've sketched out, to be sticking this on fucking BBC One before Eurovision and Disney in 2025. I mean, some serious bravery being shown in putting this out. And like the Zygon episode, it's sort of where it kind of falls apart is the sort of like just the absolutely close read that the metaphor leads you to. I have to say that I think the sort of the sort of the glitter with teeth, essentially, which is what this
Yeah.
is that real sort of, because it's also interesting when you look at the trajectory of Eurovision, right? Eurovision has always been political, and on multiple levels. One is the sort of the geopolitics of Eurovision, right? And the way that sort of the sort of cliched, sort of slightly snarky broadsheet read on it all the way through the 70s and 80s was that it was sort of Eastern Bloc countries playing out their own political sort of disputes with each other through the medium of songcraft. And then there's also, the relationship between, Eurovision and the queer community in terms of just sort of radical representation in contexts where you wouldn't expect to find it.
Yeah.
Eurovision has undergone a massive reputational shift, I would say, in the last 10 years, where it's gone from being this sort of quite fringe cult, quite sort of queer coded thing that it was sort of probably in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or something to sort of indulge, to like an absolute mainstream tentpole centerpiece. It's the highlight of a lot of people's calendar. I went to a gig last night. And I was seeing something relatively niche upstairs in the venue, but downstairs in the venue in Hackney was a Eurovision party, and it was absolutely packed to the rafters. This will be one of their biggest nights of the year. And it's always one of those things where, like, when I think camp is something that's really sort of misunderstood in a lot of this context, because when basically normie straights get involved in camp, and you sort of end up in this world where people going like, oh, it's just a bit of fun, don't politicize it, don't spoil it by bringing politics into it, whereas like, A, Eurovision has always been political, and B, camp in particular has always been a political tool used by, a repressed minority for a long time. And so I kind of think I enjoyed the teeth and the bravery with which that episode actually foregrounds this, of being like one of the campest episodes of Doctor Who, and one of the sort of let's absolutely go there kind of episodes of Doctor Who as well.
Yeah.
I don't think it entirely works, and as I say, I think it basically falls down the same the same crevasse that the Zygon episodes did, of like it goes so far with the intent, but ultimately it can't stick the landing. But I was riveted watching this.
It can't. It draws that parallel, but it can't fully commit to it either. So it's that thing, exactly like the Zygon one, where it is about that, right?
Yeah.
But it can't literally have Kid be a member of Hamas,
No.
or for there to be a kind of controlled zone of the planet that's occupied by it doesn't have that. The other thing that I was a bit kind of eye rolly about, and I want to be extremely clear here that I am not drawing a parallel with Israel-Palestine when I make the point that I'm about to make. But it was just another example, like Kerblam, of like the corporation does something bad.
Yes.
Somebody reacts against that, but they went too far.
Yeah, I mean that's.
And I would just, on occasion, if we're going to kind of be cartoonish, like to maybe it's the lot of modern hyper therapy aware, sort of ambivalent, both sidesy kind of 21st century television. But we don't get good guys who are good guys and bad guys who are bad guys anymore. Even like, I'm not making the point that I think that Kid should be a Hamas guy, and great, because obviously, I don't think, there's no justification for what happened, the pogrom of October 2023, just as I personally believe there's no justification for the wild, disgusting actions of the Israeli military, and particularly in recent weeks with the
Mm.
denial of humanitarian aid to cross. Well, I mean that's been consistent, but it's very much the stated policy now.
Yeah, they're not pretending about that anymore.
No,
It's
exactly.
disgusting.
So but this is sort of where it falls down. Like you're asking me, you know, Juno Dawson, RTD. They're asking me to draw these parallels, but they're not really like. I'm not quite sure what I'm meant to think about Israel Palestine after having seen this. Right? Am I meant to be?
And is that a flaw with the Eurovision episode of Doctor Who?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know,
I know what you mean.
but also maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is there is no neat resolution to the issue within the episode, and there is no neat resolution to the issue in real life. Maybe that is the point they're making. But I guess at some level, at some point, it would be nice to sort of have an exploration of issues where it's not left so ambivalently up in the air. Where I'm not suggesting that they should do an Israel-Palestine episode and be unambiguous about, right, we believe like this side has it all right, or this side has it all right. I'm not suggesting that they should do that, because I think that would also be weird. But forgetting Israel-Palestine, park that for a moment. We have had a kind of run where it's like, oh, these people would be good if only if they hadn't overreacted. And like, well, okay, well, what are you saying that the good non-overreaction looks like, and how does that work? How does that work? You know, in Kablam, right? You're a workers' rights activist. Okay, going around killing people, not the answer. I think we can all agree. What actually should that guy have done?
Yeah, what is your recourse then against Amazon?
Yes.
Like,
What is Kid? What
you
should
write a polite
Kid,
email? Yeah.
What should Kid be doing? Right.
Yeah.
And I feel that we've had so many now. Let's put a cap on this. Well, yeah, they may have had a point, but they went too far. And let's start having a more interesting exploration of they have a point. What should they do?
Yes, absolutely. And the sort of, you know, where is the Doctor in all of this as the I topple empires kind of guy? You know, when you need him to come and topple some empires. I think it's I think you're sort of getting at something here that I think, like, there is a fine line, right? I mean, reality is famously murky in you know, in how we understand things. Basically, that is just an experience of life. It is fully shaded by grey. And art, I think, does have and can be particularly thrilling when it sort of probes those areas in a smart and intelligent kind of way, where often that sort of nuance, which you know, really requires a deft hand and a curiosity about the issues to follow them where they lead. Like, where it all falls down is where that gets compressed into like both sidesing, you know, which is actually both sort of centrists to both sides issues think that they are asking for sort of nuance and exploring that sort of morality sort of intelligently, but are in fact just trying to put a simplistic read on it and say like, well, you know, but you know, and
well, they're trying to absolve themselves from having to make a moral decision about it.
Well, that too, absolutely. And I think so. I mean, I would absolutely say I think there will be a lot of people, and I may be one of them, that thinks that this episode does both sides the issue in a way that is highly unhelpful. That said, Kablam also came to mind in terms of relatively recent episodes, which centre a terrorist whose cause you may feel has some certainly some sort of moral validity behind it, and it's very much the, you know, I sympathise with your predicament and I deplore your methods, sort of, you know, bosh bosh. There we go. That's that issue dealt with. That said, I think, and we touched on this a little bit when we talked about Lucky Day a couple of weeks ago. It's like the 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 main crime of Kablam is the finger wagging speech at the end. And likewise, that was also my issue with Lucky Day, is that it's like, if there is at least an attempt, I think, in both episodes to explore that grey zone, but then to give you a lecture on the end, coming down massively hard on one side. And to her credit, I think Juno Dawson resists the need to sort of, well, either to spell it out for you or to basically, I appreciated the lack of a speech telling us what we should think about it, because I think in the Pete McTighe episodes, I think that is what always makes these things a million times worse.
And I did think that it was sort of quite effective. We should probably not talk about the Interstellar Song Contest without at some point discussing Murray Gold. But I did. So when what I'm about to say is not meant to be a praise of Murray Gold, but dramatically, I felt that Cora Saint Bavier's song at the end, because she's obviously one of the Hellier people who sort of passed for not being Hellion.
Yeah.
Played, I thought, brilliantly with brilliant sort of despairing reserve by Miriam Teague Lee.
Yeah, she's brilliant.
She was very good. But the song at the end, which felt like a sort of a hymn to an elegy, I suppose, for the Hellion people, which then gets the kind of emerging applause from people who had considered the Hellions troublemakers, terrorists, and certainly not to be trusted, felt both. It felt like it was very realistic in being exactly the kind of tokenistic show of solidarity that achieves nothing. Like,
yes,
it was what there was. That's what there is. It's what there is.
Yeah.
And so it felt at the same time like absolutely necessary and absolutely nowhere close to helping. It's like, and I thought that was actually quite sort of moving in a very frustrating kind of way.
I think it's really interesting that you bring that up, and this might sort of broaden the discussion. If you can broaden from Israel Palestine into other things that might have been going on in this episode, I thought there was an incredible amount of sort of world building detail in here. I mean, one of the things that I loved about this episode, unambiguously, was a ton of the character detail in all of this. I think a bunch of the characters are great, but also the world building as well around some of the sort of wider things. The portrait, I know, I speak just because I am by trade, I'm a TV producer working on a lot of unscripted TV, and I've sat in TV galleries on many occasions before. Right. And I thought that the sort of portrait of that working environment at the beginning was incredibly well shorthanded. But the thing that really sort of made me wince was the line. So there's the TV producer, or the gallery producer character, and when obviously she one of the vision mixers or something, I think the character's name is Wynne, reveals that she's a Hellion traitor, and the producer says to her, this is an outrage, like, I took a chance on you, so many people wouldn't have done. And so many people wouldn't give a job to a Hellion, but I did. And there was something in that moment of like, there's a little beat about the sort of the tokenistic approach that I think is often taken, that I've seen take place in the broadcast industry around sort of broadening and diversifying practices in terms of like class and the ethnic sort of diversity, behind the camera, but still very much on the under the auspices of people who sort of reveal their hands and their prejudices as soon as like stuff starts to get difficult. And I thought that was a very deliberate. So it's just you mentioning the sort of the slightly tokenistic nature of the way everyone got to feel good about themselves, primarily for standing and applauding the Hellion folk song, the same way in which, this clearly someone who thought of themselves as a sort of, liberal thought leader within the TV industry has, there's some prejudice there as soon as you scratch at the surface. I thought all of that was really elegantly done. I also have to say,
I should probably, because
sorry,
I loved this episode. I thought it was great.
yes, I thought it was brilliant.
I really enjoyed it.
It's really funny. There are so many great jokes in this.
It's brilliantly visual. But that didn't stop me being somewhat ambivalent about what it was, how it was addressing its central kind of question. And I suspect that ambivalence is deliberately generated. I think it wants you to feel ambivalent about sort of what the direction of travel should be. I come back to I still like okay, we've had Kablam, we've had this, thank you very much. Can we please have some explorations of, okay, what are people meant to do in the face of injustice? Right? We've seen the overreaction. We can all agree that terrorism is bad, okay, but as a dramatic get out of jail free card to sort of, okay, well that gets us to allows us to both sides this, as opposed to going, okay, well, let's take someone who does have a legitimate grievance. What is their actual constructive pathway to to creating change? I don't know. Like I just feel like we're owed an episode of that right now. That's all. That's
totally.
all. Yeah. Let's Murray Gold. We talked about the fact that this is the Interstellar Song Contest.
So it's got some songs in it.
It's got some bits of songs in it, because I guess poor old Murray Gold didn't want to have to, or they didn't want him to write 40 odd songs. Do you feel he?
Do you know what? I'm glad that it was bits of songs because they play as gags, in this context where the eventually when we get around to talking about the Devil's Chord and there's only a twist there's always a twist at the end song. The Russell T Davies's faith in Murray Gold as someone who can do anything like musically was sorely stretched, I think, in that instance.
Although that episode also contains Murray Gold's finest work.
That's true. The "I've Got a Dog" song, which is I mean, you've said this, one of the funniest jokes in the whole of Doctor Who. The jokes in here. So I started making note of some of them. There's Liz Lizardine performing "I Love You, But My Heart Says No," and when they announced that, I hooted with laughter. And then when you see playing on the background Dugga Doo with which is clearly a sort of Eurodance novelty song done by some like CGI chicken or something like that. I was roaring with laughter at that. I thought, this is really good. And if it was Murray Gold who was across those, hats off. And then also, by the way, I'm going to say an entirely earned needle drop when we get Making Your Mind Up at the end. Whereas I've said before, one of the major was this a good idea things about the Devil's Chord was to do a story all about the Beatles where it's impossible to license Beatles material because no one has the money on earth to license Beatles songs for their projects. So to actually have Bucks Fizz dropped during the everything's being brought back to normal is was a nice touch, I thought. But no, the songs in this I thought were really funny.
Yes, I agree. And I also thought, you know, in addition to that, so yeah, I mean, hats off to Murray Gold, to be honest. I thought those snatches of songs were well done. I Love You, But My Heart Says No. Yes, I also laughed out loud at that. It was just unbelievably funny. The decision to go with Rylan and Graham Norton being in this episode.
They're so good. They're
Yes,
so
both
good.
of them. Yeah.
Both of
I
them.
mean,
Yeah, Ryland's brilliant in this. And like again, there are so many good jokes that he's given that he lands. So it's that one where like Belinda says, you just came back from the dead, and he says like, oh,
story of my career.
Story of my career. That's it. Yeah, really funny. The Graham Norton cameo is so funny.
Yes.
Like when he says like, I'm Graham Norton, long since dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also his sort of the serious bit, the chilling bit where he's talking about the eradication of the earth.
Yeah.
You because the thing is, Graham Norton is a performer, right? He actually is an actor and has his background there as well. And his ability to land that sound cheerfully sinister.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Yeah. It's really good.
It's really good. So,
it's really good.
Yeah,
I mean, essentially using Graham Norton as the face of Bo in this context, aren't they? Which is nicely done. Just to wind back to your mention of feelings of profound ambivalence. So Mrs. Flood turned out to be the Rani.
Yes.
What do we?
Boom. Very good. Very good.
I mean,
whatever.
Yeah, whatever. It's I like Anita Dobson. I think she's been a fun presence at the end. I think seeing her. What a surprise! She's the Rani. They eventually brought her back when considering that was sort of basically one of the only theories at various points. Do you think we'll be seeing any more of Carol Ann Ford as Susan?
I think we will.
Yeah.
I suspect we will because, I mean, well, who knows? But the kind of flashback glimpses don't really make a great deal of sense otherwise.
If they're not going to do something with it, but then it wouldn't be the first time that one of these things has
that's
been
what I'm
played.
saying. Like you
know. I realize that as a fan, I am so I very much like intellectually and ultimately with my heart, as we discussed with the story in the engine in particular, it's like I'm very much of the view that Doctor Who should be sort of crusading into new territory, new storytelling territory. Give us something we haven't seen before. Nevertheless, I am entirely susceptible to nostalgia of to the point where you get a brief flash frame of Carol Ann Ford, particularly at a moment of clear crisis for the Doctor, and just I was like, oh, I was like, it was a nice beat. It was a nice beat.
I found the kind of I also found the kind of Dom sub relationship between Archie Punjabi's Rani and Mrs. Flood quite funny.
Yes.
So that was quite funny. But yes, I could take or leave the Rani stuff, but it was exciting to see Carol Ann Ford. I was sort of
absolutely.
Yeah.
What I will say,
I'm sure I could be bitterly
about
disappointed over the next 2 weeks, but hey-ho.
Well, what I'd like to do, I mean, this is not something we've really done much in this run of I'll Explain Now, and we'll explain how we're going to be wrapping up this run shortly. But just to put a pin in this now, in terms of right, we've got a bit of a setup for what the finale is going to be about. We don't know yet because we haven't seen it, so I want to put a pin in this now, and then we can come back and discuss this. That the Rani, I guess, maybe one of the last reasonably well-known, unrevived classic Doctor Who villains to an extent, although very much, I suppose would be on a fan's list of things that were brought back a couple of times. Interesting thing though is that obviously the Rani we remember primarily through the prism of the basic characterization that Kate O'Mara gave us of what if the Master, but a Queen Super Bitch from Dynasty, which is basically the 80s characterization. But there is, in the two Rani stories that we got in the classic series, there's an undercurrent of science in those. There is a critique of science, where the scientific method can become amoral and ultimately immoral. The Rani is fundamentally a mad scientist. I know that's a trope that we discussed a few times on earlier runs of I'll Explain Later. So I just want to put a pin in that here to say, like, I will be interested to see if anything is done with that over the next couple of weeks, or whether or not it's camp villain female Time Lord.
Yeah, you can sort of. Yeah, I mean, you can set up in your head a sort of because she's very sciency, and yet the pantheon of gods that we've been interacting with and that have been the big bad in general have been sort of not that.
Very magic.
You can imagine maybe a conflict between those two visions that the Doctor has to sort of mediate in some way. So maybe it's going in that direction, or maybe not. Who knows?
Or maybe not.
We'll find
Who knows?
out.
We'll find out. So just to, obviously, listeners, thank you for your patience in giving us an extra week to get this episode together. You may be either pleased or disappointed to learn that there's going to be another 2-week wait until the next episode, because I am going to be on holiday next week and will not be able to record, unfortunately, during that time. But seeing as it's a 2-part finale, we will be back in 2 weeks' time with our thoughts on what they called? Is it Wish World and the Reality War?
Yes. And yes.
Yes. Yes, and yes. Thank you. So we'll be back then. We just want to acknowledge we've gone on long enough and we need to get on with our days. So we'll do a bumper crop of correspondence. Just wanted to thank Carl and Neil for your lovely and very well considered emails on our Lucky Day episode. I think we will have. I'm sure next week's the episode we do in 2 weeks' time will turn into basically a post-season debrief. So we'll be bringing out. We'll get to your emails as part of that.
If anybody does have highly developed views on the Interstellar Song Contest and its relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict, please don't write it. No. In all seriousness, we were really very, very happy with the lovely comments that we got, and the, as Matt said already, the considered opinions that people sent in our Lucky Day chat. So yeah, if people have got stuff they want to talk about from the review of these 2 episodes, then we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I was going to say the quality of engagement that we get from our listeners is absolutely exceptional, because as I say, we like I'm sure if this was a more popular show, we'd get a lot of just more sort of drive-by snark from other people. But we have a smart, thoughtful listener base, and if I've blown enough smoke up the collective arses of our listeners in order to encourage people to both arses now smoke filled, do get in touch and tell us what you thought about this week's episodes, and how you feel the run is shaping up as a whole. So yes, emails to hello@I'llExplainLater.com.
I'll explain later.
And you can find us on Blue Sky searching for I'll Explain Later.
I'll explain later.
There we go. And we will be back here in 2 weeks' time. But in the meantime, have a wonderful fortnight, and we'll see you again soon.
See you on the other side.